Partly because Jackie and I have kind of been here before, so in a way I've asked her the questions that I always wanted to ask, but now I'm in front of people, some of whom have never met Jackie before and some of whom know her very well, so it's a funny mixture. And the exhibition is both kind of makes it easier and more difficult to talk about because it covers such a long period. So that is, I mean, in a relatively small space, it's covering nearly 50 years, which is really extraordinary.
It is, yeah.
And you don't often get that in a commercial gallery, do you? Such a huge range of work from different periods. So it's challenging, but I'll try.
Can I say the same for me? It's challenging, but I'll try.
It's also interesting because some pieces that are quite familiar and other pieces are not at all. But let me ask you first of all, who made the selection?
I don't know how to answer that. I think Neve made the selection, but I think she would have been working with Richard, because I can't see that would...
Richard and I worked on it.
Yes. And of course, I also partly made the selection by what I chose to show them, because that's always that, isn't it?
So go into that in a bit more detail. Can you explain how much, what you're keeping away and what are you revealing?
Ooh. Well, always more to come. Don't know. I mean, these big drawings are sort of to the point. I mean, I only showed you them as photographs, didn't I? Because we couldn't get them out. They're too big for the studio I've got now. But they've never been shown. And I did show another kind of pair at Roche Court, and I just felt I wanted them to be seen. I mean, it's very funny because everybody assumes that everything, you know, if somebody shows regularly, they assume everything has been seen, but it's not the case. You know, there are sort of chunks of time when you just don't get an invitation.
So did you have to kind of delve deep into store cupboards and unroll things? Is it a matter of just like what kind of energy you have to get to the back of the cupboard?
No, I've moved studios relatively recently, so things have come to the fore.
So you know where things are?
I wouldn't say I know where everything is. Every now and again I get in a panic and think, oh, I have no idea where that is. But Sylvia has helped me with the big drawings because they were, they'd had some rough handling, hadn't they? So
They're real.
They're real, yeah. They've had a life. And she helped me tidy them up.
So do you want us to go away with the impression that there's a lot more to see that none of us have seen before?
No, because people will have seen different bits at different times. Mm-hmm. I mean, Richard was just mentioning the show at the Whitechapel. Well, you know, that's a long time ago now, so there's a whole audience that hasn't seen the work at the Whitechapel.
Absolutely, yeah.
And there's a piece which I really love, which I call Dog, which is a funny little scuttling piece. And, you know, people just won't have seen it for years.
And nearly a year ago, you were preparing your show in Middlesbrough, about to open it.
Yes.
That was a big moment. So how did it compare, this smaller retrospective, let's say, to that big retrospective? How do you feel in comparison?
Gosh, you know, it's a huge difference. Because I think, well, it was interesting, because I was talking, I don't think Henry's still here, but I was talking to Henry from the Freelands, and he was talking about some paintings that were here. And there's a kind of intimacy here that there wasn't at MIMA. And I don't have any criticism of the MIMA show at all, but I think a smaller space invites a different kind of looking. So I would say that's the huge difference.
But also you'd gone through that big exercise of reviewing all your career for Middlesbrough.
Yes.
You've now put that behind you in a way. I imagine you might feel a little bit liberated.
Well, there were things that I didn't know about because Richard's been buying work at auction. So I haven't seen these since the 70s.
Okay.
They haven't come out of my cupboard. So it was extraordinary to come here and see them again. And, for years, we did these sort of slideshows, and you'd show people your work time and time again. And then you'd see it suddenly in someone's home. You think, well, I didn't know it was that size. Because everything changes scale.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
And in a way, that's very evident here, the big and there are more big things than one might expect, I think, in this show, whereas Middlesbrough, I suppose also with the scale of the galleries, things seemed perhaps smaller.
Yes.
There are two notable omissions, I think, here. You haven't got those earliest bone china pieces.
Yes.
Was that a deliberate omission because it was too complicated to add them?
Too complicated, and we wanted to avoid it being another survey exhibition,
right,
specifically. Okay. So we had to make quite strategic omissions. There's no textile work as well.
Exactly, that's what I was going to say.
Yeah,
yes.
So it was very much intentional, not to mimic Nima, but to kind of be more specific about what we were looking at.
Right. So the earliest pieces are here from I think they're from 1977. I think all of them are from 77.
Is that what they're marked up as, 77?
I'll ask you for the dates.
The answer is, I think there are some earlier ones than 77.
But these ones are 77, I think.
I think they'll be earlier. Some
Okay.
of those will be earlier than 77, I think.
Okay.
But I'd have to... I'm great at kind of moving dates around, so
Yeah.
I always think, who's the most unreliable person in the room? The artist who made the work. And never ask me about size, because I'll be on the phone and someone will say, well, how big is it? And I think,
Well, would you like to say a bit about how you make these pieces? Because some people will know nothing and it's quite complicated and maybe counterinstinctive.
Yes. I'm going to... I will say how they're made, but I'm also going to say that it always reminds me of sewing. It always reminds me of making clothes, because you're making things to fit together. And, I've just rolled out sheets of clay and waited until they got quite stiff. And then you can put them together and they'll hold their form.
And the patterning?
And the patterning on these is completely on the surface. So most of it is sort of, there's a bit that's inlaid, like the very thin lines will be inlaid with probably some kind of oxide. And the thicker lines are all sprayed.
So those are all on the surface, whereas
Yes.
around the same time, you were also making ones in which the clay itself was coloured. And
That was later, yeah. So that's when I got the Bicentennial Fellowship, we were living in New York. That's when I started to inlay them.
So this is a nice group of works which are similarly composed.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting.
When you talk about sewing, are you talking about a pattern?
Yes, because I don't think I did make a pattern for them, but I think I could rationalise them in the same way that I would think about putting a dress together. Yeah.
So I suppose in this exhibition that you're less obviously a ceramicist and more of a sculptor, painter, drawer. Let's not get bogged down too much in categories, because I think I've done that, haven't I? And guilty of that categorisation and trying to struggle with it. And it seems quite holistic, I think, rather than people, maybe not just me, struggled in Middlesbrough about, are you a ceramicist, are you a craftsperson, are you a fine artist, and so on. But one thing I did learn from talking with you in writing that essay was I hadn't quite appreciated how dynamic the British craft world was in the 70s.
Yeah, it was fantastic. Yeah.
And perhaps more active and supportive than the fine art world might have been.
Much more, yeah.
So for me, that was a real discovery, because it was just kind of preceding when I began working. I just wonder if you could say a bit about that, because I think it's something that's not very well known, and it must have been very, very interesting to be part of it.
Well, when you're growing up, you don't know any differently from what you experience when you're growing up. And that's what it was like being part of the craft world at that moment. And we were a group of women, and we were quite feisty. I mean, because we were a group. I mean, because at point in my life, I was excruciatingly shy, except when I was with my friends. And we tended to, it was a group that kind of hung together quite loosely. And, you know, 3 of us might be in one show, 2 in another, then 4 of us would be together. And yeah, we were so positive. I mean, but we were also very critical of each other. And sometimes I wished that I didn't have that wah, wah, wah in my brain, and I could just say to people, oh, that's wonderful. But I always have this sort of critical voice that says, yeah, but you could have done it that way. And what about it if it had been like that? And I suppose that's because that's how I think and how I move my own ideas on.
And you were contemporaries, weren't you? Very much contemporaries.
Yes.
Although you hadn't all studied together.
No, no. So the core group had been at the Royal College. So the year below me was Elizabeth Fritsch, who's showing up at the Hepworth at the moment, and Glenys Barton, who's always shown as a sculptor and never as a craftsperson. Then in my year there was another person called Jill Crowley, who always worked figuratively. And then the year above there was Carol McNichol and Alison Britton.
And do you think you were women together because, or why were you women together? Why were there no men in that group, do you think?
I have no idea, because there were male students there and we got on well. I don't know. I mean, I've always said that we came into the world at the same time as the Craft Council was invented. And the Craft Council needed a way to frame the work. And in framing the work, they framed us.
And did they promote you as woman artists?
No.
No, I don't think so.
No, it was totally irrelevant. And so the thing that I found very shocking when I sort of shuffled a bit sideways and thought, I'm going to try this fine art world, was how unsupportive it was and how prejudiced it was against women. So, yeah, it was a rude awakening, actually.
And the Crafts Council was conceptually but also financially supportive, wasn't it, in making
Yes.
things happen for you?
Yes, it was.
So,
And the British Council, don't forget. The
Yeah.
British Council was sending us literally all over the
Yeah.
world.
so in many ways it was a very fortunate beginning.
Super lucky. Yeah,
Yes.
really lucky.
Although some people would tell your story as if, you know, you got into the wrong camp too early, but I don't think that's how you would see it.
Never, no,
No.
never, no. Because I think that those early years, they're your bedrock. They're the thing that make it possible for you to go forward. You know, get the wrong start and you'll be battling all your life. Get the right start and you're just slightly mystified when things go wrong. How did that happen? And so, yeah, I feel boringly lucky, really.
You touched on, when I was talking with you a year ago, you touched on the role of David Queensberry.
Yes.
And again, he was a figure I knew almost nothing about, but I now understand he was very significant. Could you say a bit about him at the Royal College?
Yes, I think times have changed so much now. Everything to do with education is to do with how you justify every single thing you do. And in those days, we didn't even have to turn up. I mean, you know, some students worked all night and were never seen during the day. You just slightly knew they'd been in. There was one student who, I think he was mainly a car salesman, actually. And he put transfers on toilets to sell them as Victorian toilets. And there were, you know, people with mental health problems, as they're described now, so people who barely functioned, but it was all tolerated. And we felt a little bit hard done by, because we were thinking, well, you know, come on, teach us something. But it isn't until you leave that you understand you've been taught how to survive. And also you've been taught how to look around you in the world and draw from what's around you. And, you know, my wonderful friend Carol McNichol just died. Well, when Carol arrived at the college, the whole world changed. She was just brilliant.
Yeah, we better not go too far into that
No.
or you'll break down. But you haven't talked a little bit more about David Queensberry.
Yes, well, Queensberry ran a design business in the college. And so he would be busy working along with Martin Hunt, who worked with him. We didn't see, I mean, we saw him every day, but he didn't talk to us. He just sort of got on with his work.
But was his being so in touch with reality and a new reality? 'Cause
Yes.
he seemed to have a finger in every pie.
Yes.
Did that have ramifications for you?
Well, I think it did in the sense of who he employed and also how he let us behave. Because one of the things that Carol instigated were these parties where people from the whole college would want to come to the ceramics department because that's where things were happening.
Yeah.
You know, it was brilliant.
And happening, so do you mean it was fashionable or happening artistically that you were pushing some boundaries?
I think she was particularly pushing some boundaries, and also she'd arrived with a much more sophisticated intellectual outlook. And I think, you know, a good education is an education where you're nudged and shuffled. And we were definitely nudged and shuffled by the people around us because we came from such different backgrounds.
Would it be right to think that both your own background and Queensberry's interests were maybe more industrial than previously would have been the case at the college?
It's sort of the opposite. The college, I mean, I've spoken to David recently, and he's in one of his big upsets is how few students went on to be designers. You know, so he, in some sense, I think he feels he failed. But in his failure, he created this sort of wonderful environment in which people could flourish. And also, just how he chose students.
But your own background being, I suppose, you know, not far from the potteries and knowing about factories and how factories did production line ceramics.
Yes.
That was important for the way you worked, wasn't it?
It was important.
And didn't that match up with him?
Well, I went to the college thinking I was going to be a designer. So it did match up with him, but it just didn't work out that way.
And did he see you as someone he'd lost, you know, in that?
No. I don't think he ever saw any potential for me to be a designer.
Right.
You were allowed to do a lot of floundering. I mean, years later, I said to him something about being a designer. He looked at me and he said, "You're far too pig-headed." You know, and I just thought I had this sort of wonderful kind of idea of how society could be. So, you know, what I thought was a great idea for a dinner service was a nightmare for someone else.
So, if the 70s is characterised by ceramics,
Yes,
then we jump on to the mid-80s,
yes,
when you're beginning to try some very experimental sculpture, but also in ceramic.
yes,
But these drawings fit very well with that moment, don't they?
Yes.
Because the drawings of this, I suppose, I don't know, I haven't talked to you about them before, they're like preparatory drawings for the sculptures that you're going to make?
no, they're not.
How does it work then?
They exist at the same time, but the drawing, it's a bit like when I went on to paint. The drawings are on a scale that I couldn't work at. And what I think is wonderful about working two-dimensionally is you don't have to worry about how the thing stands. I mean, none of these stand. None of these would possibly stand. They'd wibble-wobble or they'd flop. And so it's a sort of wonderful liberation. So on the one hand, you have all the technical constraints of how you're going to make something, and is it possible to fire it, and what colour is it going to be, and, you know, how's it going to sit in the world? And on the other hand, you've got this complete freedom.
And how did you arrive at these shapes? 'Cause it almost looks as if you drew a body on the paper.
Yes, I will have done.
You will have done.
Yes.
And whose body was that?
Well, I would say anybody, but I don't think they're always me.
How could you do that?
Well, because we know how to imagine ourselves, even if we're not,
Right.
even if it's not accurate, we have a kind of feeling of how we are and how we exist.
So they are imaginary. Because they look very much like tracings almost.
Yeah, no, they're imaginary.
And do they relate to dance?
I'm afraid they relate to sex, if we're allowed to say that.
Well, that was my next question. They also have a very dance-like quality, and I was thinking what was happening in the British art dance world at that time was also very. I mean, you've always been interested in dance, haven't you?
Yeah, I've loved dance.
Yes.
Yes, really loved dance. And yeah, David's here, who worked a lot with dancers, and yeah, it was wonderful to go and see those.
But you're saying
dances.
no, dance is not really relevant here.
Well, I think the thing is to never simplify things. So I think when you see something, you can always sort of layer it up. You can say it's sex, it's dance, it's Indian sculpture, it's swimming. It's all these sort of physical, you know, some static and some real things that, because you're a living being, so everything comes onto the paper.
The sculptures are very clearly hollow, aren't they?
Yes.
And which is always quite, there's a strangeness about that hollow quality, even though they're so sexual and carnal, you might say. I guess you don't get that same kind of dislocation in the drawings.
No, I mean, it would be interesting to ask people if they feel that the sculptures are hollow, because knowing they're hollow and feeling they're hollow are two different things. I don't know that you necessarily, with the object in 4 parts, I'm not sure one necessarily knows those are hollow.
And the sexuality, which now we can talk about, do you think that was upsetting or difficult for people 40 years ago in the sculpture world?
Well, it wasn't, yeah, I don't know, because I think it was just, well, I think the fact that it was clay was annoying for the sculpture world.
That was the sticking point.
I think so, and because it was certainly the sticking point for the craft world, was these weren't right for clay. So I think I got it from both sides, really.
And yet it was right, because you could make that form.
Yes,
it worked.
yes, and clay can be anything, literally. So, which was always my argument, was can be whatever you want it to be.
Yeah. How many more drawings are there like this then?
Only another one.
Right. Is there anything you'd else like to say about those drawings? Because they are quite remarkable.
Just that I'm thrilled they're out in the world.
How about the patterning and the kind of tattooing, moire, kind of net-like quality?
Oh gosh. Well, it's funny now because you see so many tattoos, don't you? And I always wanted a tattoo, but I never knew what that tattoo would be, so I never had it done. And I just love Japanese tattooing. You know, the idea that you're never naked because you're always covered in this pattern. I just thought was wonderful. So yeah, and my grandfather, who'd been in the army, had tattoos, which I really loved. So yes, so they are tattoos, and they're about because of that thing of at that moment in society, tattoos not being permitted really, except if they were well hidden. There's also this thing of people thinking that tattoos are ugly, and I was really interested in all those things to do with when is something ugly and when is it beautiful. And even when I was working on, not this ceramics, but ceramics a bit later on, I was always trying to nudge up against what's beautiful and what's ugly.
And you, I mean, I suppose a little bit later on you came to deal much more obviously with taste and the question of good and bad taste.
Yes, always been snuggling out there somewhere.
That's not so obvious in this show here, is it?
No.
The kind of the bad taste.
No. It's there though, be careful.
But I guess that was particularly clear in the carpet pieces.
Yes.
In which you kind of tried to deal with British taste.
Yes, I did.
I don't see any works here which are really touching on that.
No, but you wouldn't want every show to have everything.
No.
Yes.
I was thinking before coming here that that was also very urban in a way. And one of the things that has changed for you in the last decade or 15 years is a new intimacy with landscape,
Yes.
which we do have a bit of in some of the watercolours.
Yes. Yes.
Especially in on that wall, both in the two front galleries,
Yes.
which both I think have Welsh titles.
Yes,
So maybe
yeah.
you could say a little bit about what that step into the landscape, especially the Welsh landscape,
Yes.
brought about.
Yes. Well, I have a partner who lives in Wales, and if I want to see him, I have to go to Wales.
You won't come to London.
And he lives on a hillside. And when I first went there, I'm kind of quite a restless soul. I mean, I can enjoy relaxing briefly, and then I need to work. And very soon after I started going there, I mean, it was a bit cheeky, really, because I hadn't been invited to stay. So beware. I arrived with some paper and some paintbrushes and started painting, having never really painted with watercolours before. And I think what's interesting about being in other places, and I've always had that sort of sense that the sort of joy of being in other places is you don't know what they'll give you. And also you don't do things knowingly necessarily.
Well, I was going to say that in London, I think you're a very knowing onlooker, aren't you?
Yes, I am.
You
I
know
my
how to read
territory.
London pretty well.
Yeah.
You
yeah.
know its textures, you know its
Yes.
textiles, you know which shops to go to in which areas of London to
Absolutely.
get
Yeah.
a textile from Jamaica or a textile from wherever.
Yeah, whatever. Yes.
Whereas I guess when you went to Wales, you were at sea.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, in every sense, and definitely not a country girl.
So how did you start then?
I just started.
On
I
a
mean,
small
with
or a
no-
large scale?
This sort of size, and with a grid. I mean, I don't even know why I started with a grid. And to begin with, they were very formal. And it was, I don't know, I'd been kind of doing them for, I don't know, a year or so, when Tony pointed out that they were, the first ones I did were absolutely the rooftops that we were looking down on. Because they, you know, classic kind of British roof that kind of goes straight back and then it has a little side extension, which was absolutely every single little brush stroke I was doing was just like the rooftops. But I had absolutely no inkling that that's what I was doing. And that's what I think is interesting, is you're just little human Hoover and you see things and you assimilate them. And you don't have to be that self-conscious all the time. So I do feel like two different people.
What, knowing and unknowing?
Yes.
And this watercolour, for example, seeing as we can see it, how do you start? Do you start in a corner and work up diagonally, or how does it work?
I think I probably started in the middle with that one.
And so, do you know the pattern you're trying to achieve, or does the pattern
No.
emerge?
No, and I'm not sure if I'll add other things or I'll respond to whatever's happening.
So although it looks very worked out and controlled, you're saying it's a lot to do with what you're looking at.
What I'm looking at while I'm painting,
So
yes.
what were you looking at while you were painting that?
The painting.
Okay. Okay.
Yeah,
Right.
so I've got something, with the, I mean, because I've been, you know, going to Wales now for a long time, my relationship with it's changed. I'm not an innocent anymore. And the studio in Wales is by the river. And so I've become obsessed with water. So in the back of my mind will have been this idea of water. And that's the same with one of the watercolour that we can sort of see in the next place. And in fact, in that room, both those watercolours are to do with water.
And is that from looking, or also are there interim drawings and preparatory drawings that
There's
we know?
nothing, no, there's no preparatory things. And it's not to do, it's to do with looking, but it's not to do with succeeding in mimicking it. It's as much to do with the sort of feeling of it and the sort of frustration that with water you're never going to capture it. It doesn't matter what you do. It doesn't matter if it's a photograph or, you know, there's no way. Well, I suppose a film will capture it, but nothing else will, because we're talking about nanoseconds and it's changed and the light's changed. And what's interesting, because I do sit and look at the river a lot, are these sort of repetitive rhythms you get, because then, you know, there's some stones that are making the water move in a particular way. But then, you know, after a downpour, the river sets a different mood and the stones get moved. And so, but there is that sort of, we all know that thing of looking at water and having this sort of sense of layering, of kind of clear water, you see the stones, but then there's this surface that's changing all the time and the play of light on that surface. I mean, there's a reason that we're mesmerised by it. I mean, it's just wonderful.
But these repetitive rhythms come from looking and learning about what's happening when you look at water.
Yeah, thinking and thinking about ways that you might, I mean, particularly with those, not with the ones next door, but particularly with these, where you know that there's a kind of rhythm and that has a kind of musical quality to it.
Of course, rhythm and patterning and grids and rhythms go back to,
Yes,
they go all the way
such
through,
a long
don't they?
way.
Yeah.
Such a long way.
And then another way of working is also on the wall behind you, in terms of the kind of collage or juxtaposition of very different kinds of patterning.
Yes,
Which I guess is probably the object for which you might be best well known, even if people don't know your name, the Edgware Road wrapper,
Yes,
Edgware Road Station.
yeah,
I mean, that's a kind of small example of what you're doing there.
yes.
There's not anywhere else where we've got that kind of juxtaposition in
No,
the show. But
no.